Welcome to the channel. This is a channel where I talk about real life challenges in Agile. Today, we're focusing on a very critical aspect of Agile and Scrum planning, which is mitigating risks. We do often talk about risks in Agile and how Agile teams are supposed to reduce risks because we all want better predictability so we can deliver value consistently and everyone's happy. But that's something that usually goes unnoticed when we do come up with the story points and then when we go to the planning. I'm sharing one of the strategies that I have used that have really helped Agile teams to deliver high predictable sprints. Here's a disclaimer though, there's no one-size-fits-all approach in Agile and Scrum. These methodologies are very empirical by nature, so I do encourage you to go and try and see what works best for your context. Here's what I'm covering today. Number one, how to make sure we do account for risks when coming up with the story points. Number two, tracking the cycle time of high-risk user stories and why we should do it. Number three, how to use number one and number two to have much better sprint plannings. Let's first start talking about story points and risks. We're all familiar with story points and how great they are for planning. I'm not going to dive into whether or not we should be using story points as relative estimations, which is what Scrum teaches you by the book. This is bigger than that, or some sort of more accurate estimations. That would be a 2 equals to a whole day or something like that, which is really risky by itself. It doesn't matter how you're doing it. The point is, large story points are often not only technical complexity, but also risks. And we'll talk about how we can make sure we incorporate risks as part of large user story points. Here's what happens when you do not consider risk as part of the story points. You start the sprint, and then all those user stories that you thought they would be really small, they end up taking most of your sprint. So then the team doesn't really have time to work on the other things. Or the other way around, when the team does get to them, they just don't have enough time because we assumed they would be small, they take a lot of time, and then you need to move them across the next sprint. 1. Identifying risks. Often when we do go to the sessions where we come up with the story points, we're only looking at technical complexity. How difficult is that? And if we're talking about relative estimations, for instance, how much larger the other user story is than that one. So if this is a 3 and that's a 5, that's probably, at least half of the effort or something like that. But there is more to this. There's more to just technical complexity. There's also risks. I personally love any sort of visual tool that helps us to have better conversations with our teams. And the way I do this is by using VUCA. VUCA helps us to assess complexity. It was developed in the military, then it became very popular in businesses, and then in Agile and Scrum because of the complex nature of what we do, which is software development. By considering VUCA, we can assess risks more accurately and have conversations that just go beyond technical complexity. What do we know about the situation? Is it more complex or is it more uncertain? Is it a technical uncertainty or is it a business uncertainty? I'll give you some real life examples. So number one, perhaps is a technical uncertainty. Perhaps the engineering team is really confident they can indeed do the work, but they're not 100% sure how they're going to do it. Perhaps there's been a massive redesign in the whole architecture, and they need to catch up on that. They need to get up to speed, and there's a learning curve. We don't really know how long they will take to get up to speed. We could be talking about a couple of days, or maybe there's even more unknowns that we are aware of, and that is just risk. Or number two, it's very volatile. It's something that we need to fix right away, and it's very likely to change in a couple of days. So the requirements that we have today, they're very likely to change in 1 day or 2, which means it will be in the sprint already. So what that is, that's risk. Or another example, perhaps is the lack of business clarity. Perhaps the engineers are not really familiar with all the business requirements, or maybe business is not so confident that that will fix the problem that we have at the moment. And that's also risk. And that also gives us the opportunity to have conversations regarding how much unknowns are we talking about here? Is that user story really ready? Let's just review our definition of ready and see if we can really accommodate that story in the sprint. Maybe it needs a little bit more work. Or maybe by reviewing all the unknowns, you come up with the agreement that maybe we're better off with a spike for now. Let's just experiment. Let's just have a small user story that's a time-boxed spike and see how we go. For all the scenarios where you're going ahead with that user story, you might want to consider bumping up the story points to accommodate risk. You might be wondering, well, do I really need to change my original estimates to accommodate for risk? I have, I've been doing that with my team. We have our own way to do it. I don't want to change what we have agreed that a 3 or a 5 is for the last couple of months. I don't want to change how we're doing it. I just want a way to flag something as high risk. Here's my thought on that. Let's say you're using VUCA and you're talking about technical complexity, business complexity, you're talking about unknowns, technical unknowns, businesses unknowns, and there's just not a lot of unknowns for that specific user story. That means certainty is very high. If your certainty is very high, the team is very likely to break that down into small user stories where they know exactly what they need to do for each one of those. And naturally, they will end up having lower numbers. They will be 2 or 3s or whatever you're using for small size user stories. Hence, leaving higher story points for high risk user stories or high complexity tasks. It also keeps sprint planning very simple. It doesn't change the fundamentals of Scrum when you go to the planning. It's just a matter of filling up your capacity and then you go to the sprint. Now that we've talked about risks and how to accommodate for risks as part of the story points, let's talk about tracking their cycle time. The biggest problem with high-risk user stories is how unpredictable they are. And that's what we want to avoid, right? We want high predictability so that we deliver value consistently and everyone's happy. What do I mean by that? Is that you would naturally expect a similar proportion in cycle time. So if you have a user story that's got 2 story points and then you have another user story that's marked as 5 story points, you would expect maybe a third or up to a half of difference of their size and also their cycle time. So it doesn't matter what a 2 or what a 5 means for the context of your team. If it's, a day or a couple of days or whatever, you would naturally expect that difference in cycle time as well. And that's not what happens with high risk user stories. They're just too unpredictable and their cycle time tend to go through the roof. We must embrace risk as part of the empirical work that we do, but we also need to manage it. Knowing how much risk we can afford in one sprint in the context of our team is just key. Really well-refined small user stories, they tend to go quicker than we thought they would. And that naturally gives us a little bit of a buffer to work with high unpredictable tasks. So here's the answer that we're after as part of step number 2. Given the context of this team, looking at all the historical data, how many high-risk user stories we can afford to accommodate in one sprint and still have a high chance to achieve the sprint goal. That's the answer that we have. Once we have that answer, we're ready to go to the sprint planning and talk about step number 3. Step number 3 and final step. We go to the sprint planning and now it's the time to put all that we've done as part of step number 1 and number 2 into action. So you're using VUCA and you're having much better discussions regarding unknowns. You are in fact accommodating for risk when you come up with the story points. You're looking at historical data as well. If it's the first time that you're doing it, you might want to go with just a couple high-risk user stories and see how you go. It's the same thing when we're just kicking off a new Scrum team and we don't have velocity by looking up historical data. You just define a baseline. It's the same thing here. So you either define a baseline or you look up historical data if you have been implementing step number 1. So you go to sprint planning, step number 3. What you do now, it's pretty simple. So you have the historical data that you hopefully prepared before the sprint planning. So as a facilitator, as a Scrum Master, an Agile coach, or informal or formal leader, you go through the sprint planning and you have that data with you. You know how many high-risk user stories your team can afford. And then you just navigate the discussions. You facilitate the session to just make sure you do not accommodate more high-risk user stories than the team can really afford. That's pretty much it. So this approach embraces risk, but it makes it much more manageable. It helps to give us much more predictability and it boosts teams' morale by doing that as well. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed. And if you did, please give it a like and subscribe, and I see you next time.